The hall was silent in the way that only a room full of powerful beings could be silent. Heavy, deliberate, and full of unspoken calculations. Ambassador Idara Okonkwo stood from her seat at the center of the Grand Forum, and every eye in the chamber turned toward her. Compound eyes, thermal pits, crystalline sensors, and everything in between, all locked onto the tall woman in the dark gray uniform. She did not slam her fist on the table. She did not raise her voice. She simply gathered her documents, placed them neatly into her case, and nodded once to her delegation behind her. "We are done here," she said. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried through the chamber like a crack in glass. The translation systems embedded in every seat rendered her words into 43 languages simultaneously, and in every single one of them, the meaning was the same. The Terran delegation rose as one, 12 men and women in matching gray, carefully blank, and they walked toward the eastern exit without looking back. High Mediator Zalithra of the Thessani watched them go from her elevated platform at the head of the forum. Her 4 hands were folded in front of her, and her silver-blue skin flickered with the faintest trace of bioluminescent stress patterns that she hoped nobody else noticed. She had mediated over 200 interstellar disputes in her career. She had brokered peace between species that had been killing each other for centuries. She had talked warlords down from genocide and convinced empires to share planets they both wanted to burn. But she had never seen a human walk out of a negotiation. In 300 years of galactic diplomacy, humanity had always talked. They argued, they shouted, they threatened, they bargained until the stars themselves seemed tired of listening. But they always stayed at the table. That was their reputation. Stubborn, relentless, impossible to outlast in a debate. And now Idara Okonkwo had simply stood up and left. The murmuring began almost immediately. Delegates leaned toward their aides. Secure communication channels buzzed with encrypted messages. The Vorthani ambassador, a massive reptilian figure wrapped in ceremonial armor, allowed himself a thin smile that showed the edges of his teeth. But Zelithra was not watching the door through which Okonkwo had left. She was watching the humans who had stayed. There were 2 other groups still seated in the chamber, and this was the part that made her stomach turn cold. On the far left of the human section sat a delegation wearing rust-red uniforms with frontier stars stitched into their collars. These were the representatives of the Rimward Confederacy, the outer colonies, the border worlds, the people who lived on the edge of explored space, and had built their lives in the places that the core worlds had forgotten. Broad-shouldered man named Tobias Wren, and he had not moved from his seat. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching Okonkwo leave with an expression that was impossible to read. On the far right sat a third group, smaller, stranger, dressed in sleek white suits that seemed to shift and ripple like living fabric. These were the delegates of the Ascendant Collective, the transhumanist stations and deep space habitats where humanity had begun to remake itself in ways that made even other humans uncomfortable. Their representative was a woman named Sarah Voss, though woman was a generous simplification of what she had become. Her eyes had no pupils, only a smooth silver surface that reflected the chamber lights. She sat perfectly still with a calm that went beyond patience into something mechanical. Zelithra activated her private channel to her senior aide, Korath, who sat 3 rows behind her. "Korath," she said quietly, "the Terrans have left, but the other 2 human factions have not. What are they doing?" "Waiting, High Mediator," Korath replied. "I believe they intend to speak." And they did. Tobias Wren stood first. He did not ask for permission to address the forum. He simply stood, and the room gave him its attention because he was human, and right now every alien in the chamber wanted to understand what was happening. The Rimward Confederacy wishes to make clear that Ambassador Okonkwo speaks for the Terran sovereignty and the Terran sovereignty alone. he said. His voice was rough, the accent of someone raised on a world with thinner air and harder soil. We remain open to negotiations regarding expansion rights in the Orion Vale, and we are prepared to discuss terms independently. Before the murmuring could settle, Sarah Voss rose from the other side of the chamber. Her voice was smooth and precise, each word delivered like a perfectly cut gemstone. The Ascendant Collective echoes the Confederacy's position, she said. We do not recognize the Terran sovereignty's authority to end negotiations on our behalf. We represent ourselves. We always have. The chamber erupted. Not in violence. These were diplomats, not soldiers, but in a storm of whispered conversations, urgent messages, and rapidly shifting alliances that Zelithra could almost feel reorganizing in the air around her. The power dynamics of the entire galaxy were rearranging themselves in real time. The Vorthani ambassador's smile had grown wider. He saw opportunity, a cracked empire, pieces to be claimed, leverage to be exploited. Several other delegations wore similar expressions. The Chelith were already leaning toward the Ascendant Collective section, no doubt eager to discuss biotechnology. The Korathi Trade Union had turned its full attention to the Rimward Confederacy, smelling profit. Zelithra watched all of it, and she felt something that she had not felt, in a very painful way. Long time. She felt afraid. Not of what was happening now. She could manage a diplomatic crisis. She had done it 100 times. But of what this meant for the future. She had studied humanity for her entire career. She had read their histories, their philosophies, their war records. She knew what they were capable of when they worked together. A species that had gone from burning fossil fuels on a single planet to controlling 100 star systems in less than 4 centuries. A species that had fought the Keth Dominion to a standstill during the border wars, when every analyst in the galaxy had predicted their extinction. That humanity, united, focused, restrained by the need for internal consensus, had already been the most dangerous species the Concord had ever encountered. And now that unity was gone. The delegations around her saw a broken species. They saw weakness. They saw pieces to be picked up and alliances to be exploited. Saw something different. She leaned toward Korath and spoke in a voice so low that even the chamber's surveillance systems would struggle to catch it. This is not a negotiation tactic, she said. They are genuinely breaking apart. Korath hesitated before responding. Is that not to our advantage, High Mediator? Zelithra watched Tobias Wren shake hands with a Chelith delegate. She watched Sarah Voss accept a data tablet from a Korathi trader. She watched the empty seats where the Terran sovereignty had been, already growing cold. No, she said quietly. It is not. She could not yet explain why the thought filled her with such dread, but the feeling sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Somewhere deep in her instincts, the old instincts, the ones that had kept her species alive long before they had learned to build starships, something was screaming at her to pay attention. 300 years of unity had made humanity manageable, predictable, containable. Whatever came next would be none of those things. And as the forum dissolved into a frenzy of new alliances and hasty negotiations, Zelithra sat alone on her platform above it all, watching the galaxy rearrange itself around the absence of something it had never truly understood. The fire had not gone out. It had split into 3. 6 weeks after the walkout at Thesson Prime, the galaxy was busy congratulating itself. In the corridors of the Vorthani hegemony's capital, a sprawling fortress city carved into the face of a dead moon, Ambassador Drekthar reviewed the latest trade agreements with the satisfaction of a predator who had just found wounded prey. The Rimward Confederacy had signed an exclusive mineral exchange deal that undercut Terran prices by 30%. Frontier worlds that had once been locked behind the Terran sovereignty's tariff walls were now shipping raw materials directly to Vorthani processing stations. It was the kind of agreement that would have been impossible 6 months ago, when humanity spoke with one voice and negotiated as a single bloc. But humanity no longer spoke with one voice, and Drekthar intended to exploit every crack in the Foundation. He was not alone in this thinking. Across the galaxy, the Chelith Combine had opened a biotechnology exchange program with the Ascendant Collective. The transhumanists had always been constrained by Terran bioethics regulations, rules written by people who still lived on planets and breathed natural air, and aged like their ancestors had. The collective had chafed under those rules for decades, and now that the leash was off, they were sharing research that made Chelith scientists tremble with excitement and terror in equal measure. Gene sequences for accelerated neural growth, tissue samples from post-human augmentation projects, theoretical frameworks for consciousness transfer that the Terran sovereignty had classified at the highest level and buried in vaults on Mars. All of it was flowing freely now, traded for Chelith bioreactors and organic computing substrates that the collective had always wanted but could never acquire through official Terran channels. Meanwhile, the Terran sovereignty itself was not idle. Ambassador Okonkwo had returned to Earth. Immediately begun a diplomatic tour of the inner colonies. She gave speeches about stability, about tradition, about the importance of the core worlds standing together in uncertain times. She was calm and measured and reassuring, and the Concord's analysts noted with approval that she seemed focused entirely on internal consolidation rather than external expansion. Everything was going according to plan, or so it seemed. The first warning came from a Vorthani intelligence officer named Sarath, a mid-level analyst assigned to monitor human military movements in the frontier sectors. She filed her report on a Tuesday, or whatever passed for Tuesday on a moon with no natural day-night cycle, and marked it as routine. It was not routine. Total fleet tonnage across all 3 human factions has increased by approximately 40% since the split. Her report read, "This increase is distributed roughly equally among the Terran Sovereignty, the Rimward Confederacy, and the Ascendant Collective. Each faction is independently expanding its military capacity at a rate that exceeds any observed buildup in the past century." Her supervisor read the report, frowned, and requested clarification. Surely the numbers were wrong. A 40% increase in 6 weeks was absurd. Even the Vorthani hegemony, with all its industrial might, could not achieve that kind of expansion without stripping entire systems of resources. Sarath ran the numbers again. Then she ran them a third time. The numbers were not wrong. They were conservative. She had missed the Ascendant Collective's orbital construction platforms hidden in the deep void between star systems. She had underestimated the Rimward Confederacy's ability to convert mining ships into warships, using modular frameworks that their frontier engineers had apparently been designing for years. And she had completely failed to account for the Terran sovereignty's reserve shipyards on Europa and Titan, which had been officially listed as decommissioned, but were now burning at full capacity around the clock. When the revised report was finished, the number was not 40%. It was 100%. In 6 weeks, humanity's total military output had doubled. Sarath's supervisor read the updated report in silence. Then he walked it directly to the Hegemony's War Council, without stopping to eat or sleep. The War Council chamber was a circular room carved from black stone, lit by bioluminescent strips that cast everything in a cold blue glow. 12 of the most powerful military minds in the Vorthani hegemony sat around a table that had been used to plan conquests for over 4,000 years. Sarath stood before them and presented her findings. She showed them fleet movement data, construction estimates, resource allocation patterns, and procurement records that her team had intercepted from human supply chains. When she was finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Let me understand this correctly," said War Marshal Kethrin, the eldest member of the council. The humans have split into 3 separate nations. Each of these nations is now independently building a military force that rivals what the unified human state possessed before the split. That is correct, War Marshal. So where previously there was 1 human military, there are now effectively 3, each approaching the strength of the original. Yes, War Marshal. And these 3 militaries are not pointed at each other. Sarath hesitated. This was the part that had kept her awake for 3 consecutive nights. No, War Marshal, all 3 factions are expanding outward. Their defensive postures are oriented toward non-human space. There is no indication of any military tension between the human factions themselves. No border fortifications, no patrol conflicts, no weapons. Testing aimed at human targets. They appear to be competing with each other, but the competition is directed entirely at us. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls around them. Kethrin leaned forward, his scarred face illuminated by the blue light. You are telling me that we have taken a single enemy and helped it become 3 enemies, each as powerful as the original, and all of them still pointed in our direction. I am telling you what the data shows, War Marshal. Another council member, a younger officer named Veshka, spoke up. But they are signing trade deals with us. They are sharing technology. The Ascendant Collective is selling us their research willingly. Why would they arm against us while trading with us? Sarath had an answer for this too, though she wished she did not. Because they are using our resources to do it, she said. The minerals the Rimward Confederacy sells to us are extracted at a fraction of their cost, and they are using those profits to arm their forces. Actual reserves. They are keeping the majority for themselves. The technology the Ascendant Collective shares with the Chalith is 2 generations behind what they are actually developing. They are getting us their leftovers and using the payment to fund their current research. And the Terran Sovereignty's diplomatic tour is not about internal consolidation. Our intercepts suggest that Ambassador Okonkwo is quietly negotiating mutual defense agreements with every inner colony, building a coalition that is loyal specifically to Earth. She paused and looked at the War Council with eyes that had seen too many numbers and not enough sleep. When humanity was one empire, they restrained themselves to maintain internal cohesion. The frontier worlds wanted to expand faster. The transhumanists wanted to push further. The core worlds wanted to build bigger. But they held each other back, because consensus required compromise. That compromise is gone now. What it always wanted to do, as fast as it can, with no one to tell it to slow down, and they are using us, all of us, as the fuel. War Marshal Kethrin stared at the data projections floating above the table, 3 expanding spheres of human influence, growing outward like the shockwave of an explosion in slow motion. We thought we were dividing them, he said quietly. Yes, War Marshal, we were wrong. Sarath nodded. We did not divide them. We simply removed the one thing that was holding them back. The War Council sat in the blue light and said nothing for a very long time. Somewhere across the galaxy, 3 human civilizations were building, growing, and racing against each other with a fury that only humans could sustain. The desperate, burning need to be the best, the strongest, the first. And the galaxy, which had spent centuries learning to manage one humanity, was about to discover what it meant to face 3. Of that silence, pressed down on everyone in the room, like gravity itself had doubled. None of them slept well that night. The war on Tessevar 4 lasted 72 hours. It was not supposed to be a war at all. The Tessevari and the Drenith had been fighting over a shared moon for the better part of a decade, a slow, grinding territorial dispute that the Galactic Concord had been content to let burn itself out. Neither species had the firepower to do real damage, and the conflict served as a useful distraction that kept both of them dependent on Concord mediation. Then the Rimward Confederacy got involved. Nobody invited them, Nobody asked for their help. A rimward patrol fleet was passing through the sector on what was officially listed as a navigational survey when it detected weapons fire near the disputed moon. 40 minutes later, Commodore Elena Vasquez of the RCS Iron Horizon sent a message to both sides on an open channel. "This is Commodore Vasquez of the Rimward Confederacy. You will both cease fire immediately. If you do not, I will cease it for you." Tessevari ignored her. They had been fighting the Drenith for 10 years and were not about to stop because some human told them to. The Drenith made the same calculation. Both of them were wrong. In 12 hours, Vasquez had disabled every orbital defense platform around the disputed moon, grounded both fleets, and deployed a peacekeeping force on the surface that outnumbered both armies combined. She did this without killing a single combatant, a fact that the Concorde's military analysts found more disturbing than if she had simply destroyed everything. It meant the Rimward fleet had the precision and restraint to neutralize 2 entire militaries without casualties, and that kind of surgical control required technology and training that no one had known the frontier colonies possessed. By the 48th hour, both the Tessevari and the Drenith had signed a ceasefire. By the 72nd hour, the Rimward Confederacy had brokered a permanent territorial agreement, established a joint resource-sharing framework, and left behind a small monitoring station staffed by 6 humans in rust-red uniforms. The entire operation was completed faster than the Concorde could schedule a meeting to discuss whether to hold a meeting about it. The message was clear. The Rimward Confederacy could project power anywhere in the frontier, at any time, faster than anyone else could respond, and they did not need permission from Earth or anyone else to do it. But if the Rimward Confederacy's demonstration was a show of military muscle, the Ascendant Collective's next move was something else entirely, something that made military power look simple by comparison. It began with a quiet announcement on secure diplomatic channels. The Ascendant Collective was offering a new service to any species that could afford it: post-human military augmentation. For the right price, the collective would provide soldiers who had been enhanced beyond the limits of baseline human biology. Faster reflexes, denser bone structure, neural interfaces that allowed instant communication without radio signals, and the ability to survive in hard vacuum for up to 30 minutes without any suit or equipment. They called them the Void Angels. The first client was the Marathi Federation, a minor power that had been bullied by its larger neighbors for centuries. Within 2 months, the Marathi had a battalion of Void Angels integrated into their defense forces. Within 3 months, their nearest rival, the Sarathan Dominion, attempted a border raid and was repelled so decisively that the Sarathan fleet commander surrendered his flagship rather than face a second engagement. Word spread fast. By the end of the quarter, the Ascendant Collective had contracts with 14 different species. Each one now had access to human-grade military capability that they could never have developed on their own. Dependent on the collective for maintenance, upgrades, and replacement personnel. A dependency that the collective's leadership understood perfectly and exploited with ruthless efficiency. The galaxy's balance of power, carefully maintained by the Concorde for thousands of years, was being dismantled piece by piece by a faction of transhumanists who operated from stations hidden in the void between stars. And then, the Terran sovereignty made its move. Ambassador Okonkwo appeared before a joint session of the Terran Parliament on Earth and delivered a speech that was broadcast across every human colony and every diplomatic channel in the galaxy. She stood behind a simple podium, wearing the same dark gray uniform she had worn at Thesson Prime, and she spoke with the calm authority of someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. Today, the Terran sovereignty announces the Prometheus Doctrine, she said. Effective immediately, the Terran sovereignty recognizes a duty to defend any human population anywhere in the galaxy, regardless of political affiliation. This includes citizens of the Rimworld Confederacy. This includes citizens of the Ascendant Collective. This includes any human being, anywhere, under any flag. If they are threatened, we will respond. The chamber erupted, but Okonkwo was not finished. Let me be clear about what this means. An attack on any human at all, is an attack on the Terran sovereignty. We do not require a request for assistance. We do not require a formal alliance. We do not require the approval of the Galactic Concord. We will act independently, immediately, and with the full force of the Terran fleet. The response from the other human factions was immediate, and exactly as contradictory as the galaxy had come to expect. Tobias Wren, of the Rimworld Confederacy, publicly condemned the Prometheus Doctrine as Terran arrogance wrapped in a flag of protection, and stated that the Confederacy did not need Earth's help to defend itself. Sarah Voss of the Ascendant Collective issued a terse statement calling the doctrine irrelevant to our operational reality, and noting that the collective had transcended the need for external defense. Both factions, however, notably declined to say that they would reject Terran assistance if it was offered during an actual attack. The Concord called an emergency session at Thesson Prime, and for the first time in Zelithra's memory, the chamber was not full of arguments. It was full of fear. She tried to rally a unified response. She proposed sanctions against all three human factions. She called for a freeze on trade agreements and a moratorium on military contracts. She argued that the Concord had to act now, before the situation spiraled beyond any possibility of control. But the coalition was already broken. The Vorthani could not support sanctions because their economy was now dependent on Rimworld mineral exports. The Chelith would not cut ties with the Ascendant Collective because they were in the middle of joint biotech research that their scientists called generationally transformative. The Marathi and a dozen other minor species refused to give up their Void Angel contracts because for the first time in their histories, they were not afraid of their neighbors. Every thread of the Concord's unity had a human hand pulling on it, and no one could agree to cut the strings because everyone was holding on to their own thread. Zelithra stood at her podium and looked out at the fractured forum. 43 species, each tangled in a different web of human dependency, each unable to act without hurting themselves. And in that moment, she understood. She understood why the walkout had happened. She understood why the split had been so clean, so public, so perfectly timed to invite exploitation. She understood why three factions that publicly despised each other had never once turned their weapons inward. It was not a collapse. It was not a failure of unity. It was a strategy that no single human mind had designed, but that every human instinct had driven. The same instinct that made them compete and argue and push each other to be better and faster and stronger. They had not broken apart. They had metastasized. 3 separate bodies, 3 separate agendas, 3 separate militaries, but one shared immune system that activated the moment any outside force touched any one of them. And now the galaxy was so deeply entangled with all 3 that cutting one out would mean cutting into yourself. Zelithra closed the session without a resolution. She walked back to her quarters alone, her 4 hands folded tightly against her chest. And she thought about a word from the human language that she had always found beautiful and had never truly understood until today. Checkmate. The last time the Pentarchy had met in secret, a species called the Halvori had been threatening to destabilize the galactic core with weaponized dark energy. That had been 400 years ago. The Halvori no longer existed. The 5 elder species did not meet lightly. The location was a dead station orbiting a brown dwarf in an unnamed system that appeared on no official charts. The station had been built specifically for meetings like this. Meetings where the true rulers of the galaxy gathered to make decisions that would never appear in any public record. High Mediator Zelithra arrived first because the Thessani had built the station. War Marshal Kethrin of the Vorthani hegemony arrived second, because the Vorthani were always eager for confrontation. Director Chelith Yenara of the Chelith Combine arrived third, her translucent form drifting through the corridor like a ghost made of pale blue glass. Grand Arbiter Solvin of the Keth Dominion arrived fourth, his massive frame barely fitting through the doorway, designed for smaller species. The fifth chair belonged to the Ulvari remnant. The Ulvari representative arrived last. As the Ulvari always did, she moved slowly, not from age, though she was old beyond any useful measurement, but from a deliberateness that suggested every step was a decision she had weighed and accepted. Her name was Tessaveth, and she was the oldest living being in the known galaxy. She had been alive when the Thessani were still swimming in their homeworld's oceans. She had been alive when the Vorthani first learned to forge metal. She had watched civilizations rise and fall, the way other beings watched seasons change, with patience and a certain resigned familiarity. She took her seat without speaking, and the pentarchy was complete. Kethrin wasted no time. "The human situation has become untenable," he said, slamming a data crystal onto the table. "Combined military tonnage has tripled. They control 40% of frontier trade. Their augmented soldiers are embedded in 14 separate militaries, and the Terran sovereignty's Prometheus doctrine has turned every human colony in the galaxy into a tripwire for total war." "We are aware of the data, War Marshal," Zelithra said calmly. "Then you are aware that we must act," Kethrin replied. "I am proposing a preemptive military operation, targeted, precise, and overwhelming. We strike the weakest faction, the Rimward Confederacy, and we destroy their fleet capacity before it grows any further. Without the Confederacy, the other two factions lose their frontier access, and the balance is restored." Director Yenara of the Chelith Combine made a sound that was her species' equivalent of a bitter laugh. "And what happens when the Terran sovereignty activates the Prometheus doctrine in response, War Marshal? You would be handing them the justification to deploy their full fleet, not against the Confederacy's enemies, but against us. The Terrans will not risk open war with the combined forces of the Pentarchy." "You do not know that," Yenara said. "No one has ever tested it, and I for one do not wish to be the experiment." Grand Arbiter Solvin of the Keth Dominion spoke next. His voice was deep and resonant, the kind of voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than from any single throat. "I propose an economic approach," he said. "We do not need to fire weapons. We control the galactic banking infrastructure, the communication relays, and the transit corridors. We can strangle them slowly, restrict their access to credit, impose tariffs on human goods, limit their navigation rights in Concord space. Within a generation, they will be forced to reunify simply to survive." "A generation," Kethrin repeated with disgust. "You want to wait a generation while they continue to grow. Without resources is impossible," Solvin replied. "Even humans cannot build ships from nothing." "They have been building ships from nothing for 3 centuries, Kethrin snapped. "That is what they do. They take nothing and make something from it. And then they use that something to take everything else. Have you learned nothing from their history?" Zelithra raised 2 of her hands, calling for order. "We are not here to argue tactics in isolation. We are here because something fundamental has changed, and we need to understand what it is before we decide how to respond." She activated the central display, and a holographic map of the galaxy materialized above the table. 3 zones of human influence were highlighted: the Terran sovereignty in blue, the Rimward Confederacy in red, the Ascendant Collective in white. Together, they formed a shape that looked disturbingly like an open hand reaching outward from humanity's origin point. "Our intelligence services have compiled a comprehensive analysis of interfactional relations," Zelithra said. "The results are troubling." She highlighted the borders between the 3 human factions. In every other instance of a species splitting into rival states, and the Concord had observed hundreds of such events over the millennia. The borders between the new nations became the most heavily militarized zones. Civil wars, border skirmishes, and arms races directed inward were the natural consequences of political fragmentation. The human borders showed none of this. There are no fortifications along any interfactional boundary, Zelithra said. No increased patrol activity. No weapons platforms. No defensive installations of any kind. The borders between the three human states are the least defended regions in their combined territory. She let that sink in before continuing. Furthermore, we have intercepted no communications, zero, indicating any military planning, directed at another human faction. They insult each other publicly. They undercut each other's trade deals. They compete aggressively for influence and territory. But they do not prepare for war with each other. Not even contingency planning. Not even theoretical exercises. Catherine's jaw tightened. That is not natural. When a species divides, the factions always fight. It is the fundamental pattern of political biology. They must be coordinating in secret. There must be a hidden alliance. We have found no evidence of one, Zelithra said. Our best analysts believe it is not a formal agreement. It is something else, something we do not fully understand. The room fell silent. It was Tessaveth who broke it. The ancient Alvari had been sitting motionless throughout the entire debate, her clouded eyes staring at something beyond the holographic display, beyond the walls of the station, perhaps beyond the present moment itself. When she spoke, was thin and dry, like wind passing over sand, but every being in the room stopped breathing to listen. I would like to tell you a story, she said. Catherine opened his mouth to object. The war marshal had no patience for stories. But Zelithra silenced him with a look. 63,000 years ago, Tessaveth began, the Alvari encountered a species called the Kashar. They were not unlike humans in many ways. Clever, adaptable, aggressive, and fractious. They had split into 4 rival nations that spent most of their time fighting each other. We saw an opportunity. We allied with 2 of their nations and destroyed the other 2. Then we turned our allies against each other, and when the last Kashar nation was weak enough, we absorbed them into our protectorate. She paused, and something moved behind her ancient eyes, something that might have been regret. It worked, for a time. But the Kashar we had absorbed did not stay absorbed. As a nation, but as individuals. Every Kashar we integrated into our systems brought with them a stubbornness that we could not breed out, train out, or engineer out. They sabotaged, they subverted, they adapted to every form of control we imposed. Not because they had a plan, not because they coordinated, but because every single one of them, independently, chose to resist. It was not strategy, it was identity. She looked directly at Catherine. It took us 9,000 years and cost us 1/3 of our empire to finally pacify them. And even then, we did not truly win. We simply outlasted them, and we were diminished by the effort in ways that we have never recovered from. The silence that followed was absolute. The humans are not the Kashar, Tessaveth continued. They are worse. The Kashar fractured because we broke them. The humans fractured because they chose to. And a species that chooses its own fragmentation is a species that understands something about itself that we do not. She turned her blind gaze toward the holographic map, toward the 3 colored zones spreading outward like the petals of a flower opening toward the light. You cannot divide what was never truly whole, she said. Humanity is not an empire that broke. They are a fire that became 3 fires, and fires do not fight fires. She settled back into her seat, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. They merge. No one spoke for a very long time. The Pentarchy session ended without a resolution, without a plan, without even a consensus on whether to meet again. 5 ancient civilizations, each older than humanity's entire recorded history, each more powerful than any single human faction, walked away from the table with nothing but the growing certainty that the galaxy had changed in a way that could not be undone. Zelithra was the last to leave the station. She stood alone in the observation deck, watching the brown dwarf's dim light filter through the viewport, and she thought about fires, about how you could stamp out a single flame with your foot, but 3 fires, burning separately, feeding on different fuel, growing in different directions. You could not stamp those out without burning yourself. And if they ever decided to merge again, she closed her eyes and did not finish the thought. Some fears were better left in the dark. 1 year after the walkout, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. Zelithra stood in her private office on Thesson Prime and studied the updated galactic influence map that covered the entire wall in front of her. Every morning she looked at it, and every morning the 3 zones of human influence had grown a little wider, a little deeper, a little harder to ignore. The Rimward Confederacy now controlled the majority of frontier trade routes. Their merchant fleets moved through space that had once been contested by a dozen minor powers. And none of those powers complained, because the Confederacy kept the lanes safe, efficient, and profitable for everyone who cooperated. The frontier worlds were booming, and every species that had signed a trade agreement with the Confederacy was richer than it had been a year ago. The Ascendant Collective had moved beyond mercenary contracts. They were now offering full military modernization packages, training, equipment, tactical doctrine, and post-human advisory staff to any species willing to pay. 18 civilizations had accepted, and their combined military capability had increased by an average of 300%. The Collective had become the galaxy's arms dealer and military academy, all wrapped into one. And the Terran sovereignty had used its year of supposed quiet consolidation to build the largest single fleet in the history of the galaxy. 700 capital ships, 4,000 support vessels, 250 orbital defense platforms, all positioned around Sol and the inner colonies in concentric rings of steel and fire that would make any attacker think very carefully before approaching. 3 factions, 3 strategies, 3 empires in everything but name, and they still had not fired a single shot at each other. Then the Keth made their move. Grand Arbiter Solvin had spent months preparing. He had watched the Pentarchy Summit dissolve without resolution. He had listened to Tessavet's warning about fires and merging, and had dismissed it as the rambling of an ancient mind too old to understand the modern galaxy. The Elvari had been powerful once, but their time had passed. The Keth Dominion was the largest military force among the elder species, and Solvin believed that the only language any species truly understood was strength. He chose his target carefully, a rimward colony called New Anchorage, a mining world on the edge of Keth-claimed space. The colony was small, only about 200,000 people, but it sat on one of the richest mineral deposits in the sector. More importantly, it was far from the Confederacy's core systems, and even farther from Terran or collective space. If the human factions were truly independent, truly divided, then an attack on a remote rimward colony would force only the Confederacy to respond. The Terrans were too far away, and the collective had no political reason to intervene for baseline humans they considered evolutionary relics. Solvin deployed a blockade fleet of 60 warships, more than enough to overwhelm any rimward patrol force in the sector, and positioned them in a sphere around New Anchorage, cutting off all traffic in and out of the system. His official statement to the Galactic Concord was brief and formal. The Keth Dominion was exercising its territorial rights over a disputed border region, and the human colonists were invited to relocate peacefully. Everyone knew what it really was. It was a test. Zelithra received the news at 3 in the morning, station time. She read the intelligence brief twice, put on her formal robes, and walked to the Concorde's communication center without waking her staff. She already knew what was coming, and she wanted to see it happen in real time. The first response arrived at 4:17. It came from the Rimward Confederacy's military command on Kepler Station, transmitted on an open diplomatic channel that every species in the galaxy could monitor. The message was text only, no video, no voice, just words on a screen. To the Keth Dominion Blockade Force, you are surrounding a human colony. Release our people. You have 12 hours. It was signed by Commodore Elena Vasquez, the same officer who had ended the Tessevar IV War in 72 hours. Selithra nodded. She had expected this. The Confederacy defending its own colony was the obvious and predictable response. The second response arrived at 04:23. It came from Earth. Selithra's hands went cold. The Terran Sovereignty's diplomatic channel activated, and Ambassador Okonkwo's office transmitted a message that was nearly identical in content, and completely independent in origin. To the Keth Dominion Blockade Force, you are surrounding a human colony. Release our people. You have 12 hours. It was signed by Fleet Admiral James Chen of the Terran Sovereignty Navy, countersigned by Ambassador Okonkwo herself. Zelithra stared at the screen. Her bioluminescent skin was flickering in patterns she could not control. Stress, fear, and something close to awe. The third response arrived at 4:31. It came from somewhere in the deep void. No fixed coordinates, no identifiable station, just a signal that seemed to emerge from empty space itself. The Ascendant Collective's transmission was formatted differently. Their communications always were, but the content was unmistakable. To the Keth Dominion Blockade Force, you are surrounding a human colony. Release our people. You have 12 hours. It was signed by Sarah Voss, Director of External Affairs, Ascendant Collective. 3 messages, 3 factions, 3 separate chains of command, 3 independent decisions made within 14 minutes of each other. And the same words. Not similar words, not words that conveyed the same general meaning. The exact same words, chosen independently by 3 governments that publicly despised each other, that competed for territory and trade and influence, that had spent a year proving to the galaxy that they were separate, sovereign, and unconnected. Release our people. Not Rimward citizens, not Confederacy nationals, not even fellow humans, just our people. As if the 200,000 miners and engineers and families on New Anchorage belonged to all of them equally. As if the political boundaries between the factions evaporated the instant an outsider drew blood. Zelethra's communication officer turned to her with wide eyes. High Mediator, we are detecting fleet movements from all 3 factions. The Rimward Confederacy is mobilizing its nearest patrol group, 14 ships. The Terran Sovereignty has dispatched a rapid response fleet from their forward base at Proxima, 31 ships. And the Ascendant Collective has. He stopped. His face went pale. The Ascendant Collective has deployed something we have never seen before. Our sensors classify it as a single vessel, but its mass signature is equivalent to approximately 90 standard warships. It appeared at the edge of the system, without any detected transit. It was already there. Zelithra closed her eyes. 3 fleets, converging from 3 directions. Not coordinated, not planned, not the result of any secret alliance or hidden communication channel. Just 3 separate expressions of the same fundamental truth that every human carried in their bones. A truth so deep and so old that it did not need to be spoken or organized or commanded. You do not touch our people. The Keth blockade fleet held position for 4 hours. During that time, Grand Arbiter Solvin received updated intelligence from his commanders. They told him about the 3 fleets. They told him about the unknown collective vessel. Him that long-range sensors were detecting additional mobilizations from all 3 factions. Not just the ships already en route, but reserve fleets being activated, construction platforms shifting to emergency production, and civilian shipping being recalled to clear the lanes for military traffic. Humanity was not just responding to the blockade, it was waking up. All of it, all at once, every faction, every fleet, every orbital platform, and every soldier, baseline and augmented alike, turning its attention toward a single point in space where 60 Keth warships surrounded 200,000 human beings. Solvin broke the blockade in Hour 4. His fleet withdrew without firing a shot, without issuing a statement, without any acknowledgement that the test had ever occurred. The Keth warships simply turned around and left, and New Anchorage was free before breakfast. 2 weeks later, Ambassador Okonkwo received an invitation to return to Thesson Prime. The Galactic Concord offered everything: full expansion rights in the Orion Vale, unrestricted trade access, recognition of all 3 human factions as sovereign entities with full Concord membership, military non-aggression pacts, technology exchange agreements, and a formal apology for what they carefully described as the Keth Dominion's unauthorized border action. Okonkwo listened to every word with her hands folded and her expression polite. When they were finished, she smiled, just slightly, just enough to be warm without being smug, and said, "Thank you, High Mediator. I will take these proposals to my government for consideration. However, I should remind the Concord that I can only speak for the Terran sovereignty. The Rimward Confederacy and the Ascendant Collective will need to be negotiated with separately. I'm sure they will have their own terms." She stood, shook Zelithra's hand, a human custom that the Thessani had learned to perform, with only mild discomfort, and walked out of the forum. Tobias Wren arrived the next day, with a list of demands that was twice as long as anything the Terrans had asked for. Sarah Voss arrived the day after that, and requested things that the Concord's legal team needed 3 days to even understand. 3 negotiations, 3 sets of terms, 3 separate treaties that would each need to be ratified independently. Zelithra managed all of it with the patience and professionalism that had defined her career. But in the quiet hours, when the forum was empty and the diplomats were sleeping, she would stand at the observation window and look out at the stars. Somewhere out there, 3 fires were burning. They had not merged, not yet. Perhaps they never would. Perhaps humanity would remain 3 nations forever, arguing and competing and pushing each other forward with the relentless energy that no other species in the galaxy could match. Had seen what happened when someone threatened to put one of those fires out. She had seen all 3 turn toward the threat with the same words, the same fury, and the same ancient promise written into every human heartbeat, since the first of them had stood upright on a small blue world and looked up at the sky. "You do not touch our people." The negotiations had collapsed, and humanity had never been stronger. Zelithra turned from the window, folded her 4 hands together, and walked back to work. There was a galaxy to manage.